Welcome back to Fly Fishing Hatches. I'm Raj Kletke, and in part 2 we'll start with one of my favorite hatches. The Trico Spinner Fall is a very common post-emergence hatch and a well-defined hatch. This is a great first hatch to discuss and fish. The spinner fall is after the male emergence, usually at night, the female emergence, usually in the morning, a molt to the spinner from the dun, mating, and for the female, egg laying. The male spinner fall usually occurs shortly after mating and the female spinner fall shortly thereafter. Again, if you don't understand these terms, please review my simple entomology series on the mayfly. By the way, this mayfly does have a family name and a full genus name, but since I can't pronounce these names anyway, I'll just call them tricos, which is what almost all fly fishermen and fly shops refer to them by anyway. There are multiple species that vary predominantly by location and size. Tricos are common throughout North America, especially on slow to moderate sections of rivers and streams. Occasionally sparse, Trico Spinner Falls commonly are quite dense and elicit selective feeding, or at least near selective feeding. In other words, what I would call a super hatch. Many mating swarms may be so heavy that they appear like smoke over the streams shortly after the female emergence and shortly prior to the spinner falls. Depending on location and weather, the trico hatches may start as early as June, although more commonly July, and run consistently almost daily for several months into October. Usually you can confidently plan a trip around a trico hatch. The trico hatches usually start early to mid-morning, but this may vary a little dependent upon the weather. Often the best trico hatches seem to occur on the nicest days, just the opposite of many hatches we'll be discussing later. Look online or check your local fly shop for the seasonal timing on your favorite river or stream. The spinner fall starts abruptly and is clearly defined with lots of rising fish. It usually lasts for several hours. This is a great hatch and brings up many large fish. Don't miss this hatch. You'll be both enthralled and frustrated. Before we tie one, let's see what a trico spinner looks like. I believe this is a trico spinner, but several tails have been broken off. The size is dependent upon the species, the brood, the sex of the trico, but all trico spinners are small. Usually a hook size 18 to 24, have 3 tails, clear hind wings, no hind wing, and a prominent thorax. The slightly smaller male is usually dark brown to almost black, while the female usually has an olive abdomen and a dark brown thorax. Note that while this is a trico spinner, it is not the form you'll be fishing. You'll be fishing a spent trico spinner, which is the form you'll see flush in the surface film. Note again that one tail is broken off in this example. And as always, thanks to troutnut.com for allowing us to use their photos. Let's tie our first match the hatch fly. For the trico spinner fall, I most commonly tie and fish Al's trico spinner. To tie this fly, place a small hook on the vise. We'll discuss the size of the hook later. Start the thread about halfway back and wind the thread to the bend of the hook. Break off or cut off the excess free end. Fill in any space created, and then wind the thread minimally forward to about the level of the barb. I happen to like barbless hooks, so I estimate where the barb would have been. Then prepare the wing material. Here I'm using polypropylene yarn, which comes way too thick, so thin it. The rule I use to thin it is to thin to what you think is right and then thin it a little more. The goal is to get the wing so it is nearly transparent when lying on the surface of the water. This example may still be a little thick, but it does show up better on video, so I'm going to use it. Once properly prepared, place the wing on top of and parallel to the hook shank and wrap the thread twice over the wing with the back portion of the wing about 1.5 to 2 times the length of the body. Next, bring the front end of the wing back and hold the front of the wing perpendicular to the hook shank. Put in several cross wraps and pull tight. Don't bring the back forward or you'll have to start your cross wraps behind your left hand, which is harder. Try it once and you'll see what I mean. Then lock the thread in place with an extra wrap or two. Pull up on the wings and cut to approximate finished length of 1 1/2 the body length. It's easier to wrap the dub thorax with shorter wings, so cut the wings now. I saved the piece from what used to be the front wing for the next fly. I also keep a cup of water next to the tying table so that I can dampen the thread before I put on dubbing. I'm using a black super fine dubbing here. Dub it quite tightly to the thread. As I'm dubbing the thread, I do try to move the dubbing up the thread, but I finally move the dubbing to the hook after I've moved the bobbin above the hook and am ready to start my cross wraps. We want to make a large thorax by cross wrapping the wings with dubbing in both directions. You'll note that I don't start figure 8 wrapping until I've built a good thorax. Keep checking the thorax below the fly as you want the large thorax because that's what indents the water and the trout sees. Check to be sure your dubbing isn't catching the hook point underneath, as I just did here. Unwind the thread and retighten the dubbing as needed. Also, you can add or subtract dubbing as needed to get a large thorax below the hook shank. I try to err on the side of making the thorax too large rather than too small. Once the thorax is properly sized, leave a little dubbing on the thread to give a slight cone shape to the thorax-abdomen transition, but ultimately finish to the eye of the hook with just the thread. You can always pick extra dubbing off if necessary. Tie off in your favorite way. I use 2 whip finishes to tie off, as this has worked fine for me without using head cement. If you do use head cement, be sure to clean the hook eye. It's very frustrating to have to always clean the hook eye on the stream to push your tippet through. Clean up any loose dubbing and trim the wings to final size if you didn't do that earlier. Some may try trimming the wing to a specific shape. I don't. I will occasionally keep the wings slightly long and trim them with my tippet nippers to the size on the stream once I compare my fly to the spinners on the water. So here is the finished Trico spinner that I fish most commonly during a Trico Spinner Fall. So, what did you notice about this fly? I'm sure you noted that it was a small hook for a small fly. Tricos are likely the smallest mayfly you'll fish. You'll need to tie hook sizes to match the size of the Trico spinners you'll be fishing. Eastern Trico spinners are generally smaller than Midwestern and Western spinners, and males are generally smaller than females, but tying sizes 18 to 24 will usually be adequate. I like and use 1X short shank hooks when available, as I believe the larger relative gap gives me better hookups. My most common tie is on a number 20 1X short shank hook. You also likely noticed that it had a large thorax and wispy wings. I suspect that you also noted the colors, as many fly fishermen noticed that first. What you noticed could be considered your triggers, the things that make you recognize this as a Trico spinner imitation. I'm sure you also noted that it was tied in reverse without any tails. Did this bother you? Does this make you wonder whether it was a Trico spinner or not? More important than what you noticed, your triggers, is what does the trout notice, the trout's triggers. Size may be the most important feature. The male spinner, which falls first, is slightly smaller than the female spinner, and some start fishing with the Trico Spinner Fall with a male spinner. I usually don't, but I do follow the rule of thumb for almost all hatches that if you're getting refusals, go one size smaller. I've not tried fishing a spinner without wings, but I think that the wispy wings dimpling the surface are likely important, although exact wing length doesn't seem to be that critical. I believe the prominent thorax is important, as this makes an indentation in the water surface which trout can see, but I have caught trout on Trico spinners with small thoraces. Color? Well, I'm not that convinced that color makes that much difference, but I still try to stay close to correct. I use white poly for the wings, and most commonly an olive abdomen with a black thorax. If you want to be a little more accurate, tie a male with brown abdomen and dark brown to black thorax, and a female with a dark olive abdomen and a dark brown thorax. Or you can match the color of the Trico spinners you find on your water. While color is often the first thing we see in a fly, it seems like it's one of the last things of significance to a trout. Just keep similar quality for your color choices and you'll probably be okay. But what about no tail? I think generally trout look for things, not the absence of things. But aren't tails a trout trigger, something that they might look for? Obviously, I don't know. I do believe that not all trout have the same primary and secondary triggers during a hatch, so possibly some trout could be looking for tails. But this hasn't seemed to be an issue since I started fishing with this pattern. It doesn't mean that I don't get lots of refusals during a Trico Spinner Fall, because I do, but I haven't noticed a difference in refusals since I started fishing with this pattern. And without the classical tail, which I think may push a small fly out of a trout's mouth, I do seem to get better hookups. Perhaps my tippet looks like a very long tail. In fact, if you want, you could leave a long free end to the tippet and have two tails if you really think this makes a difference. I don't. If you're fishing a Trico Spinner Fall in a riffle, which does happen occasionally, you have more latitude in all the features, but most of the time you'll be fishing a Trico Spinner Fall on relatively flat water, so tie your flies for that. I do admit that I commonly try one hook size larger when fishing a riffle, as I feel I may get better hookups, but the more realistic sized fly is probably better. If you want, you can also try different wing materials, as many materials have been used for Trico wings. I've tried Trico spinner wings with multiple materials. Occasionally one or the other did seem slightly better, but there has been no consistency. If you want to try different materials, thin your wing material and wet it. See which looks most translucent to you in a cup of water. To me, organza seemed a little too stiff, and Antron seemed a little too soft to hold its shape. I now tie most of my Trico spinners with the older polypropylene, not the new low-density polypropylene. Crystal Flash is my second choice, and sometimes I think that is slightly better than the poly on bright, clear days when fishing the Trico spinner sunken, which we'll talk about in Part 3. The old classical hackle wrap and cutting the bottom is my third choice. We'll tie and talk more about that fly in later videos. So, why do I like this tie? Well, it's easy to tie. Most importantly, it works. And I believe that I do get better hookups than the conventional tie because of the no tail. The major disadvantage may also be no tail, as who knows, maybe a tail is a trigger for some trout. Some also feel that without a tail, the hook doesn't have as much support and will sink quicker. This has not really been an issue for me. Now that we've tied a Trico spinner, let's learn how to fish it. In Part 3, we'll do that and then generalize the information you've learned to other mayfly spinner falls. I'm Raj Kletke, and I'll see you soon.